All right, guys, today talking to you about how grip is going to affect the matchup that you get at the top of the backswing. So, first off, let's define what each grip is, and then we'll talk about how it matches up. All right. So, for most players, when we start looking at grip as a neutral grip, what we like to see is this crease that's created by the lead index finger and thumb. It's going to point somewhere towards this trail shoulder. For a lot of my players that come in, they start off with a weaker grip, and that crease is now pointing more at like the middle of my chest, or even potentially even weaker than that, and that points over more closer to like my lead shoulder. All right, so we want to make sure it gets more in the fingertips. Get that thumb and index finger pointing a little bit more towards that trail shoulder. And then with our trail hand here, same thing. We want to make sure that that crease that's formed between the index finger and thumb is also pointing more or less towards my trail shoulder. A lot of times, again, I see people come in, they've got that trail hand really on top. It points more here or towards the lead shoulder. So we'll just make sure the grip's on a good solid spot. When you get those creases, though, pointing more at the chest, middle of the chest, or towards that lead shoulder, that would be your weaker grips. Vice versa, you get really to the other side of the spectrum, that's super strong. So each one of those is going to impact how somebody moves to the top of their backswing. I want to be really clear. You can play good golf with clear or with weak grips, strong grips. It really, I won't say it doesn't matter, but you just have to understand what matchups have to happen and understand what ball flights to expect, right? Not saying you can't hit all ball flights with those grips, but it's definitely harder to hit a draw with a very weak grip, just like it's also to hit a fade with a really strong grip. So you just have to understand what your limitations potentially could be as well as a golfer. Okay, so when we start talking about grips, let's start with the weak grip, just because that's the most common one I see from most of my players that come in. So again, that crease is going to point more towards the middle of my chest. Same thing with this my trail hand. My trail hand is going to get a little more on top of the club, and now that crease points more at the middle of my chest. This would be more like your Dustin Johnsons, your Morikawas, your Victor Hovlands. They're a little more on the weaker side of the scale when you start looking at grips. Now, with that being the case, though, that's also a reason why all of those players I just mentioned look like they keep the club way outside with the face really kind of shut. And they also look like they have a ton of like bowing in this wrist up here where it looks like they're cranking their wrist this way. You don't see the wrist moving that way, right? So there's actually a really interesting interview with, I think it's Dustin Johnson. I know it's Dustin Johnson, but I think it's Morikawa with him. And I don't remember if it's on the TaylorMade website. It might be, but it's on there. I think it's on the TaylorMade YouTube channel. But they're talking about the question is, well, how did I think Morikawa asked Dustin Johnson, like, how did you come to this like bowed position at the top of your swing? And Dustin says, well, I put when I gripped the club the very first time, I just kind of did this, and then I figured out over time that if I wanted to keep the face square, that was just kind of the position that started to happen naturally for me. I couldn't do what everyone else wanted me to do with my grip because it would leave the face wide open, and I couldn't control the ball. So it was really kind of interesting to hear him kind of talk about that. But I think that's a good message for people too, because it does tell you there is not necessarily a right or wrong way to grip the club. There are some ways that might make life easier for you over time, but I mean, realistically, like I said earlier, you can play good golf with whatever it is that you got going on there, depending on how things match up. So, yeah, with a weak grip, just understand that you're going to more than likely want more bowing or flexing or extension or flexion, excuse me, in that lead wrist. That's just typically going to be what happens. You're also more than likely going to be more often than not a fade player, which isn't a bad thing. But just know that because of that, bowing and ends up with usually like a lead arm that's quite high, usually leads to a path that's a little more left. I will tell you the cut and fade that you hit is a very strong cut, not meaning it cuts a lot, but it goes a good distance still, right? So everyone always talks about how fades and don't usually go as far as draws. That's not necessarily the case, as we see with a lot of the top players in the world. Again, because they're executing it with a very strong face and swinging kind of left on the golf ball and compressing it. So let's talk about how that then translates over to the opposite side of the scale, right? We start talking about really strong grips. So the lead hand's a little more turned on top. Again, you get that crease of the hand pointing more outside. Trail hand is going to sit more under. Again, that crease that we're referencing is also pointing more outside this trail shoulder. And that again is going to lead to you being typically more of a draw biased player. But like we saw with our fade player that had a lot of flexion or bowing in that wrist, kind of the opposite with my stronger grip player. If I'm really strong and then I tried to bow that wrist, I would shut that face so hard I would hit the ball probably into my wall behind me because it's so shut coming in. So understanding that when we see players that have really strong grips and then they take the club to the top, in order to keep the face square, they usually have more extension in that wrist now. But again, my club face would still be really square. And if I understand what to do with it from there and how to control it down to the impact point, I'm going to probably play some decent golf. So, yeah, that's kind of what it is. When we get into, I guess let's talk about neutral grips real quick. When we start talking about neutral grips or more, textbook grips, whatever you want to call it, I guess. Crease points more at that shoulder. Trail hand, again, points a little bit more at that shoulder. And that wrist position at the top really should end up looking a little flatter at the top of the backswing. It's not going to be as bowed. It's not going to be as extended, right? So that's going to be, your really strong grip players, the extended players. The only one that really pops in my head right away would be Brendan Steele. But with your neutral grips, you're going to see that position a little more common. Tiger, Rory, you'll see that that's kind of more your standard position. So again, play good golf from all of them. Just have to understand what needs to happen from up here with that position down to impact. So we'll get into that more as we go. If you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know.